This is what a good demographic pyramid looks like. It is smooth with no pits. Most are newly born and the number of people rolls down smoothly, which ensures the sustainability of the pension fund and the economy as a whole. Today's working people provide for the elderly. In Russia, it looks like this. It's more of a roller coaster, really. It has had as many as 3 falls, the so-called demographic pits, caused by World War I, World War II, and the 1990s. We talked about this in our last video. And now, on the 24th of February 2022, another event is taking place, which has and will undoubtedly have an impact on demographics in the future. So, let's see how many people have left Russia, whether the current government has managed to undo the tragedies of the past, and what the future holds. We know that Russians went abroad in the first 9 months of last year 18 million times. Does this mean that in 9 months alone Russia has lost 1/7 of its population? Fortunately, no. The available statistics on departures of citizens speaks exactly about, well, departures, not them quitting cold. In spite of this, most people continue to take holidays, go on business trips, and return from what they believe to be permanent emigration. And what's more, they do this several times a year. That is, if some Russian folk Ivan went to Georgia in February from possible mobilization and returned a little later, then ran to Turkey in September from real mobilization and also returned, and at the end of the year he went to a relocated friend in Kazakhstan and returned home on New Year's Eve, Ivan will add 3 departures into the statistics. That is, we have 3 departures counted by the FSB, but Ivan himself is currently in his home country, in Russia. There are no statistics on how many citizens have gone abroad and not returned, at least not in the public domain. Nevertheless, we can pick up various pieces of evidence of emigration. Sit back, we're going to play Sherlock Holmes here and look for those very circumstantial signs that can only give a rough, but still, estimate. But before we do, write in the comments how many people you think have left Russia. I will get activity in the comments to push the video in the algorithms, while you will be able to check your prediction later. Well, here we go. Turkey. Here we will take the number of tourist residence permits received as of those who relocated there. Russians were the main recipients of 1-year residence permit, 153,000 people. Israel looks similar. 37,000 Russians recalled their Jewish roots. Mind that last year 28,600 people from every country committed Aliyah. Georgia. Here is a more accurate way of looking at it. We found the answer of the Ministry of Internal Affairs to an MP's inquiry, which says that for 9 months, 113,000 Russians came to Georgia and did not leave. Then President Salome Zoravishvili later quoted a similar figure in a radio broadcast. Armenia, a similar story. Judging by RBC's, Russian media group, request to the Migration Service, 786,000 Russians entered the country in 10 months, while 744,000 returned to Russia. So that leaves us 42,000. Let's put it that way. Kazakhstan. Here the Ministry of Internal Affairs itself went out on a limb and broke down the facts. On the one hand, 36,000 folks were granted temporary residence permits, but on the other hand, a total of 146,000 people still remain in the country. This means that these 110,000 gatecrashers will either leave Kazakhstan or apply for a residence permit, well, because Kazakhstan have abolished the practice of visa run. So these folks will have to deal with bureaucracy to be able to stay. For the video, I will take the average between the legalized and the gate crashers, 73,000 people. And we'll do the same with Serbia. President Vučić said that more than 100,000 Russians have come to Serbia since the start of the conflict, of which 17,000 were granted residence permits. The rest either fled or are in the country as free riders. The average of free riders and legalized folk is 50,000 people. If you don't understand why I say that people can stay in the country even without official papers, you probably don't know anyone who has literally lived in Europe for several years without using a card, without showing up in the system at all, in order to apply then for settlement-based residence permit. And if you think there are few of them, gentlemen, the closer you get to Russia, the more such illegals there are. Not to mention when people are willing to try their luck in a US border prison for a chance at political asylum in the citadel of capitalism. The Americans, as usual, collect all the information conveniently presented in graphs. How many of Russian citizens do you think have rushed to the other side of the world to illegally cross the US-Mexican border? 21,672 people. That's as many arrests as there were last year. I hope that most of them found what they were looking for. By the way, I even have personal examples of my own buddies. In Kyrgyzstan, we again have to rely on words. According to the Minister of Labour, 760,000 Russians entered and 730,000 left the country. Write down 30,000. Lastly, the European Union. Figures from the European Border and Coast Guard Agency say that arrivals to the EU, minus departures, are 38,000. And now to sum up, we get 550,000 people. This is on one hand a fairly modest estimate, because there is no Dubai, Tajikistan or Uzbekistan. I think that number could easily reach 700,000. But even 500,000 able-bodied citizens fleeing their country in 1 year is not a small number. Yes, it is only 0.7% of the working-age population. Yes, it's not much. But what is it not much for? For Russia to become a desert? Yes, not much. Is it a noticeable blow to future demographics and the economy, though? Absolutely. Especially given the natural decline and the demographic pit. Events that are happening now will extend their impact not tomorrow, but into 2040. An additional outflow of 500,000 at a time when Russia has had a demographic crisis for 20 years is not going to do any good. For comparison, the natural decrease in 2019 is 317,000 people, and here 550,000 able-bodied people alone have left the country. By the way, to estimate this number, let's look at Russia's birth and mortality rates. How do we understand the pace at which the Russian world is being reproduced in the Russian land? And it is exactly reproduced, not increased by migration. Figuring it out is very easy, knowing two values: how many new hearts have started to beat this year, and how many people the Grim Reaper has taken to the other side. Let's start with birth rates. Let's take the data for 22 years. Up to 2014, Russia was doing fine, but after that we see a wild dip downwards. Everything it built up over 14 years, it lost in 6 years. The latest birth data shows that Russia has fallen back to about 2001. Moreover, the rate of births is one of the main indicators by which you can tell a lot. The extent to which people have a desire to give birth at all for cultural, social, and economic reasons. The same indicator is a consequence of emigration. After all, there is a vivid problem with censuses and population data. They are falsified, and there are no statistics on permanent residence abroad. About falsification, the fact is that the census is controlled by the local authorities and can inflate the numbers of people living in their fiefdom. Why? It's simple: to get more money from the Federal Center for Dead Souls.
Допустим, прошла перепись в Детройте, а власти Детройта говорят: вы что, вы с ума сошли, у нас гораздо больше людей, и начинают судиться с Федеральным бюро переписи. И в Калифорнии, например, то же самое происходит, но они никогда не выигрывают.
А вот у нас, если, предположим, какой-то регион, какая-то губерния приписала себе 100 тысяч во время переписи населения, может такое быть?
Ингушетия приписала себе почти в 2 раза население.
Есть...
Более того, Евкурову не хватило, он еще приезжал в Росстат и просил ему население, ему не дали, и тогда он стал недоучитывать убывающих из республики. И эту историю в Росстате знают все.
Then if you imagine that you are an immigrant who has put down roots in France, so in order to be no longer counted in the statistics of Russian citizens, you have to go back to Russia and go through all the bureaucratic procedures to be discharged. How many people even do this? I think the answer is obvious. That is why there are demographers' opinions that Russia actually has less than 147 million of population. In this sense, it is better to look at the dynamics of births, because it partly takes into account the mood of citizens and emigrants as well. You know, emigrants give birth in their new homeland, don't they? So, the combination of all the factors that add up to a favorable environment for reproduction is reflected in the number of births. In Russia, however, since 2014, something has gone wrong. To complete the picture, it is important for us to understand what happens to those who have passed away. As you can see, Russia had fewer and fewer people dying before 2019, but then came the COVID. And in 2020 and 2021 it had wild drawdowns. Then Russia hit a historic anti-record for mortality. 2.4 million have passed away. The worst happened in 2021, and it seems that COVID is responsible for these losses. But in 2022, we only have 4 months showing significant numbers, then the levels are below even 2020. Nevertheless, last year Russia got the death toll under 2 million. Here, of course, I can't really say what happened, but by all appearances, it's not COVID. And now the most important thing. If we overlay these graphs on top of each other, then we get a third indicator, the natural population gain, or natural decline if the number is negative. You'll see it more clearly now. There has been no natural gain in the 20 years of Russia's history. There were a few years of natural stagnation here, and the rest of the time Russians reproduced less and less. This requires either women to give birth more or people not to die and continue to work efficiently, like robots. And yet, strangely enough, since 2017 there has been a steep drop. Russia somehow went from a decline of 130,000 to 317,000 very quickly. Then this COVID comes, which in 2021 brings a loss of 1 million. And here we are in 2022 with 600,000 people in decline. That's certainly less than the COVID times, but still a lot more than the pre-COVIDs. By the way, now we can somehow relate the numbers of emigrants from the first part. What I've calculated alone can be compared to the natural decline rate in 2022. Besides, it's mostly the older generation who is dying, and it is the able-bodied who are leaving the country. What can we say in the end? The previously existing demographic crisis has only intensified since the 24th of February of 2022. But it is important to understand that topics such as the demographics of an entire country is a very large and long-lasting entity. I want to say that the topics touched upon in this video will not come tomorrow, or even in a year. I'm not saying that not a single child will be born in Russia tomorrow and millions will die. No, it's about a trend that could lead to disaster in 20 years' time. Remember this graph here. The problem is that in 20 years this part will have passed away, and those who are 60 years old today will be on the doorstep, and today's 40-year-olds will be out of work. In case you have forgotten the value that working people provide to the state, here is a small clip. You, as viewers of our channel, already know that people are the new oil. They are the generators of all kinds of direct tax, like personal income tax and contributions to the retirement fund, and indirect ones like VAT. In other words, as the working age population declines, so will the state's budget revenues, and so will the burden on retirees. Just look at it. Here is the number of unemployed. That is retirees and pre-retirees in 20 years' time. And that's how many of them now. That is, the able-bodied now cover this number of people. After the age 75, you could say no one, and this is how many will be in the future. The difference is enormous. The catastrophe could have been avoided if we had started having more children 5 years ago, or at least right now. But Russia's birth trend has been declining since 2014. You can see it here. Better yet, here is the data from the Russian Federal Statistics Service. If you have the question,
have the authorities thought about this before?
Of course they have. They're not idiots sitting there, and they thought about it a long time ago. Back in 2012, for example, Putin signed a decree to raise the total fertility rate to 1.7 by 2018. I'll remind you what the hell this rate is. It tells how many children a woman of reproductive age gives birth to on average. That is, if Mary gave birth to 3 children and Kate gave birth to 0, the average rate is 1.5. As you can guess, it's 2 people who conceive a child and 1 is born. So if one family has 1 child each, the population will halve in the foreseeable future. If the rate is 2, the population will remain at the same level, and if it is slightly higher, that is 2.1, then we have a good chance of an increase in the population. Now, a rate of 2.1 is difficult to achieve, and not only in Russia, but generally in many especially developed countries. That is why it is better to look at the trend here. Since the beginning of the 2000s, Russia has been doing really well. It has managed to create the conditions that allow families to increase the number of births on average. Russians even managed to fulfill the president's decree. The desired number he set out was achieved in 2014. But it has gone downhill. Moreover, it turns out that it is easier and faster to go downhill. Who would have imagined? In 2018, Russia got below 1.6. It turns out the president's indicator could not be held, and then it began to roll down further. Now the rate is about 1.5. Interesting observation here. 3 years in a row, the rate has not changed even 1 bit, which is a tad odd. That hasn't happened in 30 years of Russia's history. Whether this is due to the fact that the head of Russian Federal Statistics Service has been sacked in 2019 is unknown. But personally, it reminds me of the Erdogan case. As you understand, dictators like to appoint those who do not argue with them. So, for example, earlier this year, the president fired the head of the National Statistics Agency, exactly after the statistics came out that in 2021 inflation was 36% and the unemployment rate was 11%. Nevertheless, according to so-called official data, the situation after 2014 is not very positive. And something tells me that the war, from a demographic perspective, will only make this reproduction trend worse. Because on the one hand, military action will definitely increase the death rate. Exactly how much is a big question. The official data says it's under 6,000 people, although the data varies greatly. Some say there are 100,000 and 200,000. All we can say is that the 6,000 deaths forced the launch of a 300,000 mobilization. This is all according to official figures. On the other hand, the birth rate should go down because it has become more expensive to live. Even if not as dramatically more expensive as I assumed, there is definitely more uncertainty, and these events, even if not catastrophic, will contribute to a long-standing negative trend. Plus, 500,000 have emigrated, according to the most conservative estimates, which will also contribute to the trend. The important thing to understand here is this. Tomorrow will not be a disaster, but if the trend continues, every year there will be fewer births, more deaths, and the pension fund will increasingly need replenishment. Another important point, all the fertility figures in 2022 that we have given are those conceived in 2021 or before the 24th of February. So it is very interesting to see the birth rate in 2023 and 2024. And if you think back to one of our previous videos, from which we know that from the new territories Russia got by the most conservative pre-war estimates 6.2 million people, whereas 10% to 20% of that number emigrated. But it is difficult to compare anything at all here because it's mostly young people who emigrated, but in the so-called new territories there are people of different age. It is clear to everyone that the elderly are unlikely to move anywhere. But if we imagine that nothing changes and Russia will have 500,000 people losing their jobs each year, then in 10 years, the entire so-called gain in population from the new territories will be gone. That's not much of an investment on a national scale, to be honest. In general, it all depends on your perspective. If you compare Russia's situation with Ukraine, then yes, Russia's situation is much better. Even take emigration alone and leave the rest of the conditions Ukrainians have to live in untouched. They have about 8 million who emigrated to Europe, which is 19% of population. Even if we safely estimate that it's about 1 million Russians who left the country, it is not even 1%. Plus, the environment for having children there is a lot worse than in Russia. It's like Russia fired a missile at Ukraine, but also shot itself in the foot. So, if one of the objectives of the war is to make another country much worse off from a demographic point of view and simply to worsen its own demography, then one can really consider that the objectives of the special military operation have been fulfilled. Maybe there are no idiots in power in Russia, but in this case, the demographics of the Russians are not their primary concern. You know who to share this video with. We say a big thank you to our supporters on Patreon. And I'm the researcher.